Hey everyone, it's Trevor here, and I just wanted to make a quick little video about one of my favorite childhood games, Pitfall: The Lost Expedition. I never hear anybody talking about this game, and I don't think I've ever met anyone that's even heard of the game, which I still find pretty crazy considering how influential the first Pitfall was way back on the Atari 2600. Also, critics seemed to receive this game pretty well when it came out, and apparently it sold pretty well too, but it still seems like no one talks about this, and this has been the last mainline entry in the Pitfall series, which is a real shame because I think this game is a real gem even in 2020. Pitfall: The Lost Expedition was released on all 6th-gen consoles and PC back in good old 2004. You know what? Now I think I see why no one talks about this game. I remember playing this game with my dad back in 2004 when it came out. We even bought the strategy guide for this game, which just shows how old this game really is, because, be honest, when's the last time you even saw a strategy guide for a game? And no, I'm not talking about Ninja's top 100 tips to get a victory royale in Fortnite. The game's a mix of a puzzle platformer, a 3D Metroidvania, and even some little mixes of Indiana Jones here and there. The game follows Pitfall Harry, who's a witty and charming ladies' man who makes his living off discovering lost treasures. And no, I'm not talking about that treasure hunter. The story in the game is pretty light and simple, but it basically is just revolving around Harry crash landing with a bunch of other explorers somewhere in the South American jungle, and he is sort of tasked with going out to rescue all the explorers so that they can all get out of the jungle. And along his adventure, he runs across his past nemesis, St. Clair, who isn't really explained why he's there at all, but we're assuming it's just generic bad guy. He wants to do bad things with the natives and wants to use their ancient stuff for bad stuff. That's about as much development as that villain gets. And eventually the plot just ends up devolving into trying to go to the past to save the natives from the Spanish invaders, but there's a lot of plot holes associated with that, but they just seem to kind of force this at the end to sort of arbitrarily raise the stakes of the story because they felt like they needed to, and I guess trying to get out alive is not, big enough stakes. Despite being a game that's rated E, it can be pretty scary and dark at times, and I remember this game giving me a couple of scares back in the day when I was a little boy. This isn't so bad. Why was I scared of this as a kid? No, I'm done. Cut it. I'm out of here. No, I'm not doing that. Similar to its clear inspiration of Indiana Jones, and even its later successor in Uncharted, it has slight mystical elements to the story, but I would say of all three of these, this one easily is the most fantastical with its elements, but I think it pulls it off the best as well, because it's very clearly supposed to be kind of a fun, non-serious or grounded game.
No need for thanks. Oh, part of the job.
The main issue that I have with this story is mostly just that the characters have practically no development, and most of them are just your stereotypical one-note characters all the way through, and it just feels like the story was made to fit the gameplay and not the gameplay being made to fit the story that they're trying to tell, which is just bad writing. Sorry there, just a little tickle in the throat is all. Nothing else. Like you're fighting a flaming jaguar using magic fists They're bestowed upon you by a magical butterfly. Why? 'Cause Aztec magic, of course. I guess, I don't know, I'm just coming up with a reason in my head to explain this. They don't really explain it in the game. Is this fight cool? Yeah, of course. But there's no narrative reason that this should be happening. And like, what the fuck is the point of these animal boss fights that we have? Like, sure, they're interesting enough boss fights, but I don't know, I can't explain it. I swear, the developers of this game were just on crack the whole time that they were writing it. I have no idea. The story just goes so off the rails eventually that your dumb gamer brain just sort of accepts it and goes along for the ride because the game's just so charming.
Harry. Most people call me Pitfall Harry.
So you assume I'm like most people. What are you doing?
Turning on the charm. This is my medium set.
The one saving grace of the story is the now legendary Stephen Bloom as Pitfall Harry. I mean, this man can make any scene such a joy to listen to, and he brings such a great energy to Harry, and he saves what is a dumpster fire of a story into at least a likable story, and he makes the little throwaway lines that are kind of thrown in there for humor just such a treat to listen to. To be fair though, no one's playing this game for its award-winning characters or narrative or anything. They just play it for some dumb fun and maybe a few laughs, maybe a puzzle here or there, which brings me to... The game is what is now termed as a Metroidvania, which basically just means you're moving through mostly linear levels with the occasional need to backtrack to previous areas so that you can use one of the new items that you've gotten to reach an area that was previously inaccessible. But when it comes to moment-to-moment gameplay, I really don't know why more people don't talk about this game. I mean, it's got all the American favorites here. You beat the shit out of natives to give you things.
Wake up!
You just beat the shit out of them for fun.
In the first age, in the first battle, when the shadows first lengthened, one stood, burned by the embers of Armageddon, his soul blistered by the fires of hell, and tainted beyond ascension. He chose the path of perpetual torment. In his ravenous hatred, he found no peace, and with boiling blood, he scoured the unknown place.
You're eradicating the local wildlife and cultural appropriation. What's not to love? But in all honesty, this game is just such a blast to play, even now. Something about it's just so lovable, and it really just unlocks that childhood glee inside me. Like, throughout the years, I've probably beaten this game at least a dozen times, if not more, and not one of these playthroughs have I ever felt like the game felt dated all of a sudden. I guess it's just a formula that's timeless. It also helps that the game's only about 4 hours if you're at least competent with games, and it makes sure that every minute of that is at least fun or gives you a good laugh at the most. The game's constantly taking you to new locations, and it feels like every 15 minutes or so you're getting something new to add to your arsenal of tricks. This game is really creative with its items too. Like, it gives you an inflatable inner tube, a gas mask, and some insanely overpowered TNT. And the inner tube leads to probably my favorite section in the game, which is when you take the inner tube down a mountainside half pipe. And once again, does this make any sense how this would work? Fuck no, but it's fun as hell, so who gives a shit, honestly.
This is my medium set.
One of the other highlights of this game is the music. It just has some great orchestral pieces that really get you feeling like you're going on some grand adventure, and then there's also some great atmospheric tracks that really set the mood of the area that you're in. I'd also like to point out that this game has some really impressive environments for the time. Like, sure, a lot of the textures are kind of muddy and blurry compared to today's standards, but it's pretty surprising the amount of detail in the backdrops that the game has, and sometimes it really can feel like a real living jungle that you're in at times. Near the end of the game, there's another amazing sequence where you're captured and you get all your items taken away from you, and you have to sneak through the enemy camp and slowly get back all your items. This section's just like one big puzzle as you're constantly getting new items back, and they let you go through an obstacle in the camp that lets you get past some guards undetected now, and I just think this is the game's peak, and it just really shows what this game can be when it utilizes all of its items at once and kind of fires on all cylinders. Like I mentioned earlier, this game has some boss fights with St. Clair, as well as these odd animal temples that see Harry trading places with an animal that's guarding this temple, and Harry has to fight himself essentially to gain control of his body again. He takes control of the animal, and the animal is now in his body, and it's trying to escape the temple, being able to now control his body. The animal has all of Harry's abilities, so throughout the game, as you get more and more abilities, these fights get more difficult because now the animal can utilize more of your abilities all at once. So these are pretty cool because it tests your knowledge of the abilities that you've learned throughout the game, but also how you know how to counter each ability, because that's how you win. Now, these are pretty cool the first time around because you're having to learn what the gimmick of each fight is, but on subsequent playthroughs, they're kind of just barriers because the whole charm of it is over, because once you know the gimmick, it's super easy to do these fights in like under 5 minutes. So they're mostly just barriers to the normal gameplay, which is kind of a disappointment. Then we have the fights with St. Clair, which somehow are even more underwhelming than the Animal Guardians, which were already a disappointment because the St. Clair fights are so much easier than the Animal Guardian ones. They're pretty much impossible to fail, and they pretty much just rely on one gimmick that doesn't even really use any of your items or new abilities that you've learned throughout the game, and you just repeat the process 3 or 4 times until St. Clair's sort of killed, and then you move on. So it's very clearly padding in a way to try to build up St. Clair as a villain, but they're just terrible fights all around, and I would honestly just cut them out of the game if I could. And at the end of the game, you have 2 bosses back to back, the first one being the Flaming Jaguar from the beginning, and then the second being the weird shaman dude Pushka that's been following St. Clair around, who turns out to be the real bad guy all along. Both of these fights are just super underwhelming once again, mostly because they take advantage of none of the items that you've gotten throughout the game. At most, you take advantage of Quick Step, which just makes you run faster, and that's because these fights mostly rely on artificial difficulty to make them harder, because they just make the bosses really aggressive and be able to dish out a lot of damage really quick, and there's no healing pools between both fights, so you have the same canteen between both fights, so you have very minimal healing, and so it's just hard. This is just such a shame because not even an hour before these fights, you have the scene where you have to escape the camp, and that scene was just so much better, sort of showing how to use all your tools at once in a complex and interesting way. And so that should have been a type of way of doing a final fight, because that didn't really result in cheap tactics and artificial difficulty.
Fairy godparents! Admit it! You have fairy godparents! Have a nice day!
This game just never fails to bring me back to feeling like a kid again, and I think that's just why I love it so much. It's just such a shame, though, that practically no one talks about this game anymore, and it just feels like this game's being forgotten to time. With all these resurgences of classic platformers like Crash and Spyro getting remasters, and Crash even just got a fully fledged sequel recently, I would love to see this game get the love it deserves and get an actual remaster, and I think that would be a great way to breathe life into the series again and get more people to actually experience the hidden gem that this game is. And no, the Wii release does not count as a new entry. We do not talk about the Wii game. So I'd say if you have a PS2 or a GameCube lying around, then I would definitely seek this game out. Or if you don't have either of those, you could always emulate it, which is how I played it for this time around and how I got the footage. I didn't really experience any game-breaking bugs, and I just had one audio issue occur once, which was just fixed by closing the game and reopening it. Just do yourself a favor and give this game a try, because not enough people seem to remember this game, and it's such a shame because it really is something special. This one's for you, Sam.